It was a dull, rainy morning, with the steady patter of water against the windows of Melyssa's office. The streets outside the shopping center were slick with fresh rain, a reflection of the gray clouds hanging heavily overhead. Inside the animal rescue center, things were quieter than usual. The hum of the fluorescent lights above her head was the only sound, punctuated only by the occasional tap of Melyssa's keyboard as she worked through her daily tasks. Melyssa had always loved this part of her job, the quieter moments where she could reflect, catch up on case reports, and enjoy her cup of coffee without the pressure of an emergency. As a seasoned animal protection officer, she had seen her fair share of difficult cases, but today, the stillness seemed to linger too long. Her fingers danced over the keyboard, filling out forms for the animals she had helped in the last few weeks. Suddenly, the phone rang, breaking the calm. The sound of the line connecting was followed by the familiar voice of one of the security officers from the nearby shopping center. "Melyssa, we've got a problem," the voice said urgently. "There's a raccoon on the parking lot. It's badly injured. We need your help." Her heart skipped a beat. Injured animals always triggered a rush of adrenaline. Quickly, she stood up from her desk, grabbing her coat and bag. "I'm on my way," she responded, her voice steady despite the rising concern. Melyssa knew these situations all too well. Accidents like this weren't uncommon, especially in areas like the parking lot of a busy shopping center. Cars, buses, and even pedestrians could cause serious harm to small, wild creatures who wandered too close to human spaces. A raccoon was particularly vulnerable, as their curiosity often led them to places they shouldn't be. The short drive to the shopping center was filled with her usual thoughts of urgency. She had to make sure the raccoon was stable enough to be transported to the center. She knew that speed and precision were critical in such cases. The faster she arrived, the better the chances were for saving the animal. Upon her arrival, Melyssa saw the security team standing near a corner of the parking lot, where a small crowd had gathered, but they kept their distance. At first glance, it wasn't clear how severe the injury was, but the raccoon was clearly in distress, lying on the pavement, its body twitching as it tried to lift its head. One of the security officers, a young man named Thomas, waved as Melyssa approached. His face was furrowed in concern. "He's right there," he said, pointing to the corner where the raccoon lay, looking up with wide eyes. Melyssa crouched down, moving carefully towards the injured animal. The raccoon, though injured, seemed to sense her presence and gave a soft whine as it tried to move away. Blood stained its fur, especially around the legs, where a deep wound was visible. Its breathing was shallow, and it appeared weak, but not entirely unresponsive. "Okay, little guy," Melyssa murmured softly, her voice calm. "I've got you. We'll get you fixed up." Thomas stepped back as Melyssa gently coaxed the raccoon to lie still. Her trained eyes quickly assessed the situation. It was clear the animal had been hit by a car, likely a fender bender as it crossed the lot, or perhaps even while rummaging through the trash. The blood wasn't flowing freely, but the raccoon's injuries were serious, and he needed immediate care. "Get me the transport cage," Melyssa instructed Thomas, her tone firm but kind. She needed to stabilize the raccoon first before he could be moved. He seemed to have a chance, but it would be up to her to make sure it didn't slip away in the transition. As Thomas hurried to bring the cage, Melyssa reached into her bag and pulled out a soft cloth, gently pressing it over the raccoon's wounds to stem the bleeding. Her hands moved with practiced precision, and the raccoon, although fearful, remained relatively still, likely exhausted and in shock. A few minutes later, Thomas returned with the cage. Melyssa carefully lifted the raccoon, cradling it in her arms to avoid causing further harm. She placed him inside the cage, securing the door gently but firmly. The raccoon let out a soft grunt but didn't fight back. He was clearly too weak to resist, and Melyssa could feel his heartbeat slowing. "Good boy," she whispered as she secured the cage in the back of her vehicle. "We're going to make you better." The drive back to the rescue center was smooth, though Melyssa couldn't stop thinking about what might have caused the raccoon's injuries. Every day she encountered cases like this, wild animals caught in the chaos of the human world. It was a constant reminder of the delicate balance between nature and urban development. As much as she wanted to help every animal she encountered, she knew the challenges of reintegration into the wild were far from simple. As soon as she arrived at the rescue center, Melyssa took the raccoon into the clinic. She prepared for a thorough examination, hoping the damage wasn't beyond repair. The raccoon remained relatively calm, but Melyssa noticed how tense its body was, especially around the injured leg. "I'll take care of you, don't worry," Melyssa said softly, setting up the area to treat the raccoon. The clinic was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigeration unit in the corner. Melyssa had seen many animals come in like this, injured or sick. And while it always broke her heart, she never lost hope. The job wasn't just about fixing the immediate problem, it was about restoring life. That's why she became an animal protection officer in the first place, to give animals a second chance, to return them to the wild where they belonged. Melyssa set the transport cage carefully on the workbench in the center's clinic. The dim overhead lights cast a soft glow on the room, the only sound being the occasional hum of the ventilation system. A small corner of the room was dedicated to animal recovery, with shelves of medical supplies, a counter for treating minor injuries, and a large stainless steel table for surgery or more intensive care. Melyssa had worked here for years, and she knew the layout by heart, her hands moving almost instinctively as she gathered the necessary tools. The raccoon, now resting on the table, looked much smaller up close. Its fur was matted with dirt and blood, and its body was stiff from the pain. Melyssa could see the wide-eyed fear in the animal's expression. She could hear the gentle, shaky breaths that escaped from the creature's chest. The vulnerability of the raccoon in that moment hit her hard. It was a reminder of how fragile all life could be, how quickly the safety of wild creatures could be interrupted by the chaos of human-made environments. Taking a deep breath, Melyssa began her assessment, starting with the raccoon's head. She noticed the contusions on its face, likely from the impact with a car, but nothing seemed life-threatening. The raccoon's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and Melyssa quickly moved her hands to its legs, checking for fractures. As she had suspected, the front paw was broken, badly swollen and stiff, a likely result of being struck by a moving vehicle. But aside from that, there were no other severe wounds. She felt a small amount of relief, but she knew the next challenge would be ensuring the injury healed properly. Melyssa turned to the counter and grabbed a syringe with a sedative. She needed the raccoon to stay still while she treated the injuries, and the sedative would also help alleviate its pain. The raccoon flinched when Melyssa approached, clearly still scared, but she spoke to it in soft, calming tones. She had worked with wild animals long enough to know that a calm voice, familiar movements, and minimal sudden gestures made all the difference in their trust. "It's okay," she murmured as she gently injected the sedative into the raccoon's rear leg. "You're not alone. We're going to make you better." Within moments, the raccoon relaxed, its eyes fluttering shut as the sedative took effect. Melyssa worked quickly, carefully cleaning the animal's wounds. She ran antiseptic over the contusions on the raccoon's face and used warm water to clean its fur and paws. Once the wounds were treated, she began bandaging the raccoon's injured paw. The raccoon barely stirred as she worked. She had been in this position countless times before, caring for animals that had been injured by people, often as a result of accidents or negligence. But the feeling of helplessness still lingered. Melyssa knew the world was not kind to these creatures, especially in places like this shopping center parking lot, where cars raced past at high speeds, oblivious to the small creatures foraging for food. After finishing with the leg, Melyssa stood back, taking a moment to examine the raccoon's overall state. It would need several days of rest and observation to ensure it healed properly. But beyond the physical recovery, there was the psychological aspect. This raccoon would have to regain the instincts and skills needed to survive in the wild once it was released. The trauma of being hit by a car was significant, but if Melyssa could help it recover fully, the raccoon might have a fighting chance at survival. She moved to the side of the room where a large recovery cage stood. It was fitted with blankets and soft bedding, and Melyssa placed the raccoon inside, making sure it was comfortable and protected. The animal's shallow breaths were the only sign of life as it lay in the soft bedding. Melyssa ran a hand over her face, feeling the weight of the situation on her shoulders. Each rescue, each treatment, brought with it a sense of responsibility. The raccoon, now so vulnerable, was in her care, and though she had saved countless animals before, she never let herself forget the stakes involved. Melyssa sat down at a nearby desk, reviewing the raccoon's medical notes. The leg would likely need a splint for the next few weeks, and the animal would require antibiotics to prevent infection. But overall, the prognosis was promising. After a few days of rest and treatment, Melyssa would release it back into the wild where it belonged. Still, a nagging thought lingered in her mind. What would the raccoon face once it was back in the wild? Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking her thoughts. It was a text from her colleague, Dr. Eric, who often assisted with surgeries and difficult cases. "How's the raccoon doing? Can I come by to help with the treatment?" Melyssa smiled faintly at the message, appreciative of Eric's constant support. He had been a friend for years, and his expertise in animal care was invaluable. She quickly typed a reply. "He's doing well. The injury isn't as bad as I thought, but he's going to need some rest and pain relief. I'll keep him here for a while to monitor him." With the message sent, Melyssa returned her attention to the raccoon. It was still asleep in the cage, breathing more evenly now. The sedative had worked its magic, and the raccoon seemed to be at peace for the time being. Melyssa would need to check on it every few hours, but for now, she could breathe easier. Her thoughts drifted back to her early days in animal rescue. Back then, she had felt the overwhelming weight of responsibility more keenly, wondering if the animals she helped would make it. But over time, she had learned to trust her instincts and her training. Every rescue was a lesson, and every animal that survived was a reminder of the resilience of life. Still, the fear of failure never quite went away. Melyssa stood up and walked over to the recovery cage, watching the raccoon's gentle breathing. She gently adjusted the blanket around him, ensuring he was as comfortable as possible. As she did so, she felt a small sense of hope rising within her. This raccoon had a chance. If he could recover physically and regain his strength, he could return to the wild where he belonged. But she knew the path ahead wouldn't be simple. The raccoon would face many challenges upon release. There would be predators, traffic, and a world that had become more hostile to wildlife every day. Melyssa thought about that constantly. How the natural world was increasingly encroached upon by human development. How every rescue seemed to carry with it a quiet tragedy. Wild animals were forced to adapt to environments that weren't designed for them. Yet, despite these challenges, Melyssa remained hopeful. The raccoon had already shown signs of strength. He had survived the trauma of the accident, and now he had a chance for recovery. It was her job to ensure that he was as ready as possible to survive when the time came for him to return to the wild. "I'll be here for you," Melyssa whispered softly to the raccoon. "You're not alone." Days passed as Melyssa continued to care for the injured raccoon. Each morning she arrived at the clinic early, taking the time to check on the animal before anything else. The raccoon, though still weak from the accident, was beginning to show signs of improvement. Its fur, once matted with dirt and blood, was starting to regain some of its natural sheen. The swelling in its injured paw had reduced significantly, and it no longer seemed as stiff when it moved. Melyssa spent the days monitoring the raccoon's condition, taking note of every change, every small victory. She cleaned his wounds, changed the bandages, and offered fresh food and water. Slowly but surely, the raccoon was beginning to show signs of his old self. He was more alert, his eyes no longer clouded with fear, and his movements were less cautious. Melyssa had been concerned at first that the trauma might affect his instincts, but as each day passed, it became clear that he was regaining his strength and his will to survive. But even with this progress, Melyssa could not let her guard down. The recovery process wasn't just physical, it was mental as well. She had seen animals struggle with the psychological aftermath of such injuries. Some would refuse to eat, unable to overcome the shock of their ordeal. Others would become withdrawn, unwilling to engage with their surroundings. Melyssa was careful to monitor the raccoon's behavior closely, watching for signs of distress. But there were moments, like when the raccoon would cautiously reach for a piece of fruit or nibble at the food Melyssa offered, that filled her with hope. It was a sign that he was beginning to feel like himself again. His curiosity, which had been stifled by pain and fear, was starting to resurface. Her colleague, Dr. Eric, dropped by every couple of days to check on the raccoon's progress. His calm demeanor and steady hands were a source of comfort to Melyssa, who sometimes found herself getting too attached to the animals she cared for. She had to remind herself that her role was to rehabilitate and return them to the wild, but she could never shake the emotional weight of seeing them recover. Each success felt like a small victory, but each farewell was a reminder of the impermanence of the work she did. "How's he doing?" Eric asked, peering into the recovery cage. Melyssa smiled faintly, though there was a touch of weariness in her eyes. "Better every day. His paw's healing nicely, and his appetite is back. I think we're close to being able to release him." Eric nodded, inspecting the raccoon closely. "I'm glad to hear that. The leg is still a concern, but it should be okay if you keep the pressure off it for a bit longer. Just monitor it carefully." "I will," Melyssa assured him. "I've been making sure to give him plenty of rest, and I've been offering him food that he can forage for once he's back in the wild. He needs to start adapting again." Eric gave her a knowing look. "It's tough, isn't it? You spend so much time with them, get to know their little quirks, and then you have to let them go." Melyssa sighed, turning back to the cage. The raccoon was curled up on a blanket, his eyes half closed, but he lifted his head as Melyssa moved closer, his ears twitching in recognition. "It's never easy," Melyssa replied, her voice softer than she intended. "But it's what I signed up for. I'm not just here to patch them up and send them on their way. I'm here to give them a chance to live their life, back in the wild, where they belong." Dr. Eric smiled gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're doing good work," He's lucky to have you. Melyssa nodded, feeling the familiar warmth of gratitude wash over her. She was used to hearing praise from her colleagues, but it never failed to humble her. She wasn't doing this for recognition. She was doing it because she believed in the mission, because she couldn't stand the idea of animals suffering when they didn't have to. The next few days blurred together in a series of small routines. Melyssa spent time with the raccoon each day, ensuring that he was eating and drinking regularly, and making sure he wasn't overexerting himself. She watched him closely as he regained strength, seeing small signs of improvement that brought a sense of satisfaction to her heart. But at the same time, a lingering anxiety settled in the back of her mind. Would the raccoon be ready? She had seen it all before. Animals who had made remarkable recoveries, only to be overwhelmed by the challenges of the wild. Once they were released, there was no guarantee they would survive. Melyssa knew that she couldn't protect them forever. The forest, the roads, the predators. These were all dangers that the raccoon would have to face on his own. But that was the point, wasn't it? It was about giving them a chance to reclaim their life. The wild was where they truly belonged. She had to believe that the raccoon, once healed, could thrive out there. One evening, as Melyssa sat beside the recovery cage, watching the raccoon nap peacefully, a thought occurred to her. What if I'm not ready to let him go? She had spent so many days caring for him, watching over him as he slowly regained his strength. She had gotten used to the idea of him being there, of checking in on him every morning, of watching his little habits evolve. In a way, she had grown attached to him, though she had always known that attachment was dangerous. It wasn't about her. It was about the animal and its future. The thought lingered for a while, but Melyssa pushed it aside. She had done this before. She had released animals back into the wild, watched them disappear into the trees, knowing it was the right thing to do. This raccoon, like all the others, deserved his freedom. Tomorrow, she murmured softly, standing up. Tomorrow we'll go to the forest. It's time. That night, as she prepared the raccoon's transport cage for the next day's journey, Melyssa felt a mix of emotions. Relief, pride, and a deep, underlying sadness. She wasn't sure which of these emotions was the strongest, but she knew one thing for certain. This was what she was meant to do. Helping these creatures, guiding them through their pain, giving them the tools they needed to survive. It was a calling. And even if the goodbyes were always hard, it was worth it. The morning arrived quickly, as mornings often do when there is something important at hand. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden glow over the sleepy town, and Melyssa felt that familiar, uneasy flutter in her stomach. It was the same feeling she had every time she prepared to release an animal back into the wild. Hope mixed with doubt, a sense of accomplishment tempered by the fear of what might happen after they left her care. The raccoon had recovered so well in the past few days. His paw was nearly back to normal, the swelling almost entirely gone, and he moved with a surprising amount of confidence. His appetite had returned to full strength, and his energy levels seemed to be matching the vitality he'd had before the accident. The only thing left to do now was to prepare for his release, to give him back the life that had been momentarily interrupted. But even as Melyssa set to work packing the transport cage, something gnawed at her. The uncertainty of his survival after release weighed heavily on her mind. She had done everything she could. She had provided care, nurtured him back to health, and allowed him the space he needed to recover. But once he was out of there, in the wild, he would be on his own. The forest was a place of danger and unpredictability, filled with predators, harsh weather, and the ever-present risk of human interference. There was no telling what challenges he would face, or whether he would be able to overcome them. She shook her head, trying to clear her mind of the doubts that threatened to consume her. There was no point in worrying now. It wasn't about her anymore. The raccoon had been given the chance to heal, and it was time for him to return to his natural habitat. Melyssa moved around the clinic, gathering supplies for the journey to the forest. She packed a small cooler with water and snacks for herself, making sure she had everything she needed for the trip. She knew it was a short drive, but even so, she wanted to be prepared. It was part of the ritual she'd developed over the years, a mental checklist to ensure she didn't forget anything. Every small detail mattered. If the raccoon needed anything upon release, it would be her responsibility to provide it. She glanced over at the recovery cage, where the raccoon was now awake, stretching and grooming himself. His fur was soft and clean, and his eyes, once filled with fear, were now alert and curious, his natural instincts returning bit by bit. The raccoon had adapted well, and though he had not yet fully recovered from the trauma of the accident, he was showing more and more signs of his wild nature re-emerging. The urge to forage, the keen awareness of his surroundings, the cautious yet confident movements. He was ready.
Okay, little guy, Melyssa whispered, opening the cage door. It's time.
Are you ready for the wild? The raccoon paused for a moment, his eyes meeting hers, before he bounded out of the cage with surprising agility. He seemed to hesitate for only a second, then darted towards the corner of the room, sniffing the air with his usual curiosity. Melyssa smiled softly, feeling a warmth in her chest at the sight. He was back to his old self again, or at least as much as he could be after everything he had been through. And now, it was time for him to move forward, to begin a new chapter of his life. She moved quickly to secure the cage in the back of her car. The raccoon, now quiet and focused, had settled down, curling into a ball and staring out the small window. His calm demeanor gave Melyssa a sense of reassurance. Maybe he wasn't as scared as she thought he would be. Maybe, just maybe, he understood what was happening. The drive to the forest was quiet. Melyssa's thoughts wandered as the miles passed, the landscape shifting from urban sprawl to the more open, wooded areas that surrounded the town. She had made this drive many times before, always with a sense of anticipation, always with a knot in her stomach. Releasing animals back into their natural habitats was never easy, no matter how many times she did it. There was always a fear, an anxiety that clung to her, questioning whether the animal would survive or whether she had done enough to prepare it for the challenges it would face. She pulled into a small clearing just outside the forest. It was a place she had come to know well, a peaceful area filled with dense trees and a small stream that ran through it. It was the perfect place for a raccoon to find shelter and food. There were plenty of places to forage, and the area was far enough from human activity to give the raccoon a fighting chance at survival. Melyssa opened the car door and moved to the back of the vehicle. The raccoon was still in the cage, watching her with bright, curious eyes. He was still, but Melyssa could tell he was alert. It was time. She carefully removed the cage from the car and placed it on the ground, opening the door to let the raccoon out. He paused for a moment, sniffing the air, his body tense with anticipation. Melyssa knelt down beside the cage, speaking softly to him. "It's all yours now," she said gently. "Go on. You're free." For a long moment, the raccoon didn't move. He stared at her, as though unsure of what to do next. Melyssa waited patiently, not rushing him. She knew that the decision to leave the safety of the cage and enter the unknown was a big one. After everything he had been through, he needed to make the choice himself. She had done her part. Now it was his turn. And then, almost as if on cue, the raccoon stepped cautiously out of the cage. He sniffed the ground, his little paws touching the earth, and then he looked back at Melyssa one last time. There was a moment of connection between them, a silent understanding. It was time for him to go. The raccoon darted off into the underbrush, his small body disappearing into the trees. Melyssa watched him for a moment, her heart in her throat, before he vanished completely from view. She stood up, wiping a tear from her cheek before it had a chance to fall. It wasn't the first time she had released an animal back into the wild, but it never got easier. There was always the fear, the uncertainty. Would he survive? Would he find enough food? Would he know how to stay safe? But she had to trust in the process. She had to trust that the raccoon would be okay, that he would adapt and learn, just as he was meant to. As she walked back to her car, Melyssa felt a mix of emotions: sadness, pride, and an overwhelming sense of peace. She had done her best. She had given the raccoon the chance to live a life free from the dangers of the human world, and now it was up to him to take it. She got into her car and started the engine, glancing back at the forest once more. The raccoon had a new life now, one that was his to live, and that was all that mattered. Melyssa drove away from the forest with the same mixture of emotions she always felt after releasing an animal into the wild: pride, sadness, and most of all, an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. The forest behind her seemed to fade into the distance, just as the raccoon had faded into the trees. But there was a lingering feeling, a knot in her chest that she could not shake, no matter how many times she went through this process. She had released the raccoon, given him a second chance, but what happened next was entirely out of her hands. She would never know whether he made it. She wouldn't be there to watch him adjust to the challenges of the wild. Did he find shelter? Did he find food? Did he avoid the dangers that lurked in the forest? These were the questions that plagued Melyssa's mind every time she released an animal. It was never about the immediate care. That part was simple. It was the aftermath that caused her to second-guess herself, to wonder if she had done enough to prepare the animals for the life they would have once she was no longer there. Melyssa drove in silence, the hum of the engine filling the space where her thoughts should have been. She had long since stopped questioning the decision to release animals. She knew it was what needed to happen. But there were always those moments, those fragile, fleeting moments, when she couldn't help but wonder if there was something more she could have done. Something she missed that would have made the difference. As she approached this town, the noise of the bustling city began to return, a stark contrast to the peaceful isolation of the forest. The reminder of the human world's noise and chaos was always jarring after a moment like this. The raccoon was out there, somewhere, experiencing his own journey, but Melyssa couldn't help but feel like he was a part of her. She had spent so many days with him, watching him heal, listening to his soft sounds as he rested. He had become a part of her routine, a symbol of the very work she had dedicated herself to. And now, he was gone. Released back into the wild, where he belonged, but also where he would never be able to return to her again. The phone in her pocket buzzed, and Melyssa pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Dr. Eric, asking how everything had gone with the release. "How's he doing? You okay?" Melyssa paused for a moment, her fingers hovering over the screen. She wanted to reply with something lighthearted, something that would cover the lingering sadness she felt, but instead, she typed out a simple response. "He's free now. It was hard, but I know it was the right thing to do." The message was short, but it felt like the only way she could convey everything that was going on inside her. She hit send and put the phone back in her pocket, trying to push the heaviness in her chest away. When Melyssa returned to the clinic, the familiar routine of her day awaited her. She parked her car, stepped out, and made her way to the office. The other staff members were already at their stations, attending to the animals they were caring for. Some of them waved as she entered, while others were busy with their tasks. But today, Melyssa didn't feel like engaging in the usual pleasantries. Her mind kept drifting back to the raccoon, the wildness he had returned to, the freedom he had been given, and the uncertainty that came with it. She knew it was part of the job. She had known the risks and challenges when she chose this career, but that didn't make it easier. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice calling her name. "Melyssa, how's the raccoon, doctor?" Eric stepped into the office, his kind eyes scanning her face for any sign of distress. Melyssa smiled faintly, though the smile didn't reach her eyes. "He's free. He's out there, where he belongs. I left him in the forest." Eric nodded, his expression understanding. "I'm proud of you. It's not easy to let them go, especially after everything you've been through with him." Melyssa let out a soft sigh. "No, it's not, but I know it was the right decision." Eric looked at her with a mixture of empathy and respect. "You've done a lot of good work, Melyssa. The raccoon's lucky to have had you." Melyssa glanced at him, her eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. "I hope so. I hope he's okay." "I know he will be," Eric said, his voice confident. "You did everything you could. Now it's up to him to figure it out." Melyssa nodded, though the doubt in her heart didn't quite dissipate. She had always believed in the importance of returning animals to the wild, but it was moments like these, the quiet after the storm, that made her question whether she had truly prepared them for what lay ahead. "I hope you're right," she said softly. Eric offered her a reassuring smile before turning to leave. "Take care, Melyssa. And don't forget to take care of yourself, too. You're doing good work here." Melyssa watched him walk out of the room, her mind once again drifting back to the forest, to the raccoon, and to the uncertain future he now faced. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Melyssa moved from one task to the next, caring for the animals in the clinic, making sure everything was in order. She had to stay busy, had to focus on the work at hand, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the raccoon. The long hours she had spent tending to him, the way his eyes had softened as he regained his strength, and the quiet farewell as he disappeared into the trees. There was a part of her that would always carry the raccoon with her. It wasn't just about the work she did. It was about the bond she formed with every creature that came through the clinic. Whether they were big or small, injured or orphaned, every animal left its mark on her heart. Some animals stayed for days, others for weeks, and some, like the raccoon, were only with her for a short time. But every animal mattered. Every life she helped save was a testament to the power of compassion and care. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the clinic, Melyssa sat at her desk, staring at the photos on the wall. Images of animals she had saved, moments frozen in time that captured the essence of her work. She felt a sense of pride, knowing that, in some small way, she had made a difference. But there was always the knowledge that the work wasn't over. Tomorrow, there would be another animal in need, another life to care for, and another decision to make. And Melyssa would be there, as she always had been, doing the best she could. Because that's what she did. She gave animals a chance. And in return, they gave her something far more precious. The reminder that life, no matter how small or fragile, was worth fighting for. The following days after the raccoon's release passed by in a blur of activity. Melyssa stayed busy at the clinic, attending to the various animals that came through her doors. There were always injured creatures to care for, sick animals in need of medical attention, and orphaned wildlife that required her nurturing hand. Each case was different, but each one seemed to bring with it the same fundamental truths: the fragility of life, the resilience of nature, and the pressing need to restore balance wherever possible. And yet, despite the bustle of the clinic, Melyssa found herself reflecting more than usual. The raccoon's release had left a profound impact on her. It wasn't just the difficulty of saying goodbye to an animal she had worked so hard to save. It was the realization of how much her role had changed her over the years. At the beginning of her career, Melyssa had entered this field with a desire to help, to make a tangible difference. But as the years passed, she had learned that true success wasn't measured by the animals she saved. It was measured by the chances she gave them, the opportunities for freedom, and the trust they placed in her as they healed. Each animal that left her care, whether it survived or not, was a reminder that the world of wildlife rescue was a fragile one. There were no guarantees, no promises of success, only the hope that she had done everything in her power to give them a fighting chance. One afternoon, as Melyssa was making rounds at the clinic, she found herself standing at the window, gazing out at the distant trees that marked the edge of the town. It had been nearly a week since the raccoon had been released, and the pain of letting him go had softened somewhat. The knowledge that he was free, out there in the wild, was a comfort. She had done her part. Now it was up to him. But there was still that small voice inside her, a quiet, nagging doubt that she had to push aside. Did he survive? Did he find shelter? Or had he been overwhelmed by the challenges of life in the wild? Melyssa shook her head, trying to push the thought from her mind. She couldn't let herself fall into this cycle of uncertainty. She had seen so many animals go through the same process, healing, adapting, and then being released. The raccoon was no different. He had a better chance of survival than many animals in the wild, especially with the skills he had regained. That's when it hit her. The work she did wasn't about the immediate outcome. It was about the process, the chance to heal, to grow, and to return to a life that was truly their own. It wasn't about the result, it was about the opportunity. And in that moment, Melyssa understood something she had known all along, but hadn't fully realized until now. She was not just a caregiver. She was a facilitator of freedom. She gave the animals what they needed most: the opportunity to return to the wild, to live their lives as they were meant to. And that was enough. The door to the clinic creaked open, pulling Melyssa out of her thoughts. A woman stood there, holding a small, injured bird in her hands. Her eyes were wide with worry as she approached Melyssa. "I found this little one outside," the woman said, her voice trembling. "It looks like it might have hit a window or something. Can you help?" Melyssa turned her attention to the bird, immediately assessing its condition. It was a small sparrow, its wing outstretched at an odd angle. It had been disoriented by the impact, but the injury appeared to be non-life-threatening. The bird was scared, but its eyes were bright, and it seemed to be clinging to life with determination. "I'll take care of it," Melyssa said, offering the woman a reassuring smile. "Thank you for bringing it in. We'll do everything we can." As she moved the bird into the clinic's care station, Melyssa couldn't help but feel a sense of familiarity. Another animal in need. Another chance to make a difference. Her hands moved with practiced ease, wrapping the bird's wing in a small, soft bandage and providing it with the warmth it needed to rest and heal. The sparrow, though rattled by its injury, was already beginning to settle. Melyssa took a step back, watching the bird in its small cage. There was something deeply comforting about these moments. It wasn't just the care she provided. It was the act of giving them a second chance. Each animal that came through her door was a reminder of the delicate balance between life and death, between freedom and captivity. And her role in that cycle was vital. The woman who had brought the bird in lingered for a moment before speaking again. "Do you think it will be okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Melyssa nodded. "It's too early to say for sure, but we'll make sure it has the best chance possible. That's all we can do." The woman nodded, her worry easing somewhat. "Thank you," she said quietly, before leaving the clinic. Melyssa turned back to the bird, checking it one last time before heading to the office. She paused by the window once more, the evening sun casting long shadows across the clinic's floor. Her mind, though calm, was still swirling with the echoes of her earlier reflections. She had been giving animals chances for years, and in turn, they had given her something even more valuable, a sense of purpose. It wasn't always easy. Some days were harder than others, and there were moments when it felt like the weight of the world was too much to bear. But there was also something inherently beautiful about her work. She wasn't just saving lives. She was offering second chances. She was facilitating the return to a life of freedom, a life in the wild. And as long as she could continue doing that, Melyssa knew her purpose was clear. There would always be another animal in need, another creature to heal, another chance to help. But that was the nature of the work she had chosen. It wasn't about success or failure. It was about the opportunity. Just as the raccoon had been given the chance to return to the forest, to the wild that was his home, so too would the sparrow and the countless other animals who would find their way into her care. It wasn't always a smooth journey, and the road ahead would be filled with more uncertainty. But Melyssa had learned to embrace that uncertainty, to accept that she could not control everything. What mattered was that she had given them the opportunity to live their lives as they were meant to. And in the end, that was enough.